The Wilderness Society is getting quite political and has indeed launched court action against Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek, claiming that successive governments haven't adequately protected threatened species. So there are more than 2,000 plants and animals on the threatened species list in Australia, and this list has been building over many years. And the Wilderness Society is now taking this argument to court. Professor Euan Ritchie is from the School of Life and Environmental Sciences at Deakin University. Hi, Euan.
Good morning.
This is quite interesting. What exactly is this court action about? Is this legitimate or more of a political stunt?
Well, I guess it's up to the courts to decide whether it's legitimate or not. But essentially, the case that's being put is that under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is the overarching environmental law in Australia, there's an obligation on the minister that if a recovery plan for a threatened species is approved, so that means that they need one, they need to actually create one and put it into place within 3 years. And that hasn't happened for hundreds of species. And so that is the basis of this case.
So at the heart of their case are the recovery plans. What are the recovery plans and what was actually intended by them when it comes to these threatened species?
Yeah, recovery plans are a really important document. So it basically outlines what the risks are to a species, so what's causing that species to be in dire straits, so whether it be invasive predators like cats or foxes, or habitat destruction or pollution, climate change, there might be a whole range of reasons. And then, of course, what we're going to do about it. They also outline how different organisations, and that it might even span states and territories, need to work together to help that species, because some species obviously span quite large areas. And then, what actions are going to be done to really help turn things around. And importantly, these recovery plans actually work. So things like the southern cassowary, the northern hairy-nosed wombat, the mighty Murray cod, humpback whales, they've all had recovery plans. And they're all actually turning around from the brink of extinction. So these recovery plans are really important.
Are they just being underfunded? And I imagine that recovery plans aren't made equal. The cassowary and the humpback whale might have a bit more support than some of the other threatened species that are lesser known.
Look, in general, the environment and Australia's precious wildlife and ecosystems are chronically underfunded in Australia. And also that lack of resources also impacts our ability to even create plans. So, as you said earlier, there's more than 2,000 threatened species and ecological communities in Australia, and that number continues to rise. And so it's really actually very hard for people to keep up with creating these plans because there's simply not enough people doing these plans. There's not enough funding to do that, hence why they haven't been done. And even if they are done, in many cases, they're never implemented. So there might be a plan sitting on a shelf somewhere, but there's no money to actually put that plan into place. And so there's multiple failures along the way, which, as you say, really can be traced back to chronic underfunding of the environment.
So I'm looking at some of the animals. We've got the Australian greyling, lungfish, Borden's cockatoo, black cockatoo, forest red-tailed black cockatoo, ghost bat, greater glider, red goshawk. I'm not sure. Goshawk. I don't know what that one is.
It's a beautiful bird that can be found in northern Australia and parts of arid Australia as well.
The sandhill dunnet and the Tasmanian wedge-tailed eagle. Some of them are quite prominent. The black cockatoos and the red-tailed black cockatoo are beloved.
Yep, and the greater glider. There's some really iconic species on that list, which again I think really just demonstrates that even, some of the most well-known species, the wedge-tailed eagle in Tasmania, these huge birds, these species are being neglected. And that's just a small example of the many hundreds of species and also ecological communities that are being neglected. And so what this case is really trying to emphasize is that, we have this environmental law in place and it has very clear expectations about what should happen for listed threatened species if a recovery plan is advised, and that simply hasn't happened. So, there's questions there about, well, who's accountable? Should the minister be accountable if there's a law stating that they must act on these things?
1300 222 774 is our number. Our text is 0437 774 774. And Professor Euan Ritchie is with us from the School of Life and Environmental Sciences at Deakin University. Euan, what are the legal implications, of taking the Federal Environment Minister to court over this? What's the legal basis for the argument of is it being negligent to these plans?
Yeah, it's basically not following what's in the law and the legislation. So I'm not a lawyer. I'll just put that on the table, but it's saying that basically the minister is not adhering to the law, which clearly states that, if a recovery plan is advised, that they must actually create that recovery plan, and that hasn't happened for a large number of species and ecological communities. And I think the other important point too is that should this case succeed, it's clearly going to create a precedent that puts pressure on future environment ministers, because it's not just the current environment minister that has failed to deliver these recovery plans. It's also many successive ministers in the past. So this is really, if it were to succeed, going to create a very strong precedent, I would say, that we need to see much greater accountability from our ministers. Because after all, if we have environmental legislation that's not actually adhered to, well, why have legislation in the first place?
Well, yes, that was my next question. Has there been a precedent of something similar, of a politician or government being taken to court over not implementing things? I mean, honestly, we're in election time. If every politician was taken to court over not keeping a promise, my goodness, our courts would be full.
Yeah, but again, we're all expected as ordinary citizens to, respect the law, as we should. And these laws are in place for a really important reason. Environment's really important for our economy. It is the basis of the economy. Without a healthy environment, you don't have an economy. It's really important culturally for First Nations peoples. It gives us great societal enjoyment. And these species have a right to exist regardless of what we humans think. So there's a whole range of reasons why these laws are in place to protect what we know and love. Tourists come from around the world to see the Great Barrier Reef and all our wonderful wildlife, and we know full well that we're not doing a great job to conserve those things that are so precious. So these laws are really, really important. So we should be, putting these laws to the test and saying, well, if, they're not being met, what are we going to do about it?
Are there other ways we need to be thinking about, and this question is much more in your wheelhouse, I think, than all of the legal stuff, but Are there other ways we need to think about in terms of protecting our threatened and endangered species that go well beyond these recovery plans?
Well, the biggest challenge that we have at the moment is that when the Albanese government was elected in May 2022, they promised to reform the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which was shown to be highly ineffective by a very extensive review by Professor Graham Samuel and many experts. And that hasn't been delivered. It's been put on the long sleep. We don't know whether we'll ever see that now. And so without that reformed environmental law, which was shown to be not just working for business didn't like it, it wasn't effective, and it wasn't conserving species because of the evidence at hand. So we need to see much stronger environmental laws. We need to see greater enforcement. We also need to see, of course, a huge increase in funding for conservation. So we fund, in a comparative sense, much less than the US does. They obviously have a bigger economy, but in a relative sense, we're grossly underfunding the environment. And so we simply can't conserve species and ecosystems if government doesn't fund it properly. And we know we have the capacity to. So it's been estimated by the Wentworth Group of concerned scientists that for about $7 billion per year, we could make a huge change in the outcome for the environment. Put that in perspective of AUKUS, which has been estimated to be over $360 billion. So we can afford to do this today, but it hasn't happened.
On the text line, some fan mail. Elise says she's now following you on social media. How inspiring. And another text, Fiona in Sales, says, often state governments have an equivalent to a species recovery plan for threatened species. The feds have decided not to double up. This law case is an expensive stunt. This is why I don't donate to the organisation.
Yeah, look, that's not accurate because there are, in some cases, of course, plans at a state level, but a critical part of the recovery plan is that for many species, as an example, the southern greater glider, it doesn't just occur in Victoria. It occurs in southern parts of New South Wales and the ACT.
And I should say this is the Wilderness Society as well.
Yes, that's right.
This is where it's come from,
so
is the Wilderness
this
Society.
This is far from a stunt. There are very real reasons that have also been pointed out by scientists and experts why you need cooperation between organisations that may actually span boundaries and regions that are beyond just one state or one region. Recovery plans have a really vital role in assuring that happens. It's simply not true to say that state or territory plans will take the place of recovery plans at a federal level for species.
But it's an interesting point because I think most people can feel really frustrated by the idea of money going to plans that are not implemented or going towards, legal action, whether it's a stunt or whether it's because, those plans aren't being implemented. But it's like all of this money is not even going towards on-the-ground work to make the situation better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess the point is that there's a lot of money out there, right? So we're prepared to spend $360 billion on AUKUS. So let's be honest and say there's plenty of money out there. So it's not a case of if we choose to go to court to try and actually hold governments to account and follow environmental law, that there's less money to conserve species on the ground. That argument actually doesn't stack up. So we need to see governments following the law so that we do have recovery plans and they're put into action. And we also need to see a much greater investment of resources into conserving species, into those actions like controlling feral cats and foxes, like managing fire properly, doing revegetation where it's required and so forth. And we absolutely have the financial capability to do that. And in fact, it would actually benefit the economy. So we know that if we invest in the environment, it creates jobs, it helps tourism, has benefits for First Nations communities, all sorts of things. So it's not like it's actually a cost, it's an investment.
We'll go to some talk back in just a moment. But Professor Euan Ritchie, I think for people listening right now feeling quite upset or helpless hearing about, these lovely Australian animals that are endangered or threatened, what can they do?
They can do a whole range of things. They can join a local conservation group and help to take care of their local area. Of course, there's a federal election coming up soon, and if you value the environment, you can choose to vote for a particular candidate or party that has policies that are consistent with your values. So if you feel like you're not being represented by your local MP, or whoever that might be, then perhaps you might choose to vote for someone who does put the environment, as a real priority for them. So there's a whole range of things you can do to take care of and see greater protection for the environment. I think talking to your friends and family about why you care and love, these wildlife and these areas is really important too, to spread the word. So there's a whole range of things you can do.
Professor Euan Ritchie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.